Today we're going to talk about the 1920s in American history. The first thing to talk about is the Red Scare. This is something that happened right off the heels of World War I and the Russian Revolution. Because the Russian Revolution created the world's first communist nation, the Soviet Union. And many Americans were terrified that the U.S. might fall to communism as well if we let our guard down. Now, this justified fear quickly turned to paranoia, and many people were arrested or deported simply on suspicion that they might have communist ties. Now, the U.S. economy during the 1920s was very good. It was very strong. The U.S. emerged from World War I victorious, and since the war happened in Europe and not in the U.S. did not have any of the post-war damage to rebuild to our infrastructure. Many industries really boomed in the 1920s, including the automobile industry. You have Henry Ford and his classic Model T car. He invented the assembly line, which led to mass production and a lowering of prices to where now even the middle class and even some working class people were able to afford automobiles and radios, things that were seen as luxuries before. The movie industry, Hollywood, really started in the 1920s. At first, it was the silent movies, and then by the end of the decade, you had the talkies, Talkies, that they called, where you actually had sound. You had, people speaking. And this all led to consumerism, materialism, and also prosperity throughout the country. Now, the automobile industry really transformed the United States. Cars meant faster transportation. So this meant you could live farther away from your work. It also meant you could travel more. It expanded tourism. It connected people in rural areas to urban centers, so you didn't feel so far away anymore. And it really unified the nation in that way because you could now get to different parts of the country faster. And people now had more of a choice in where they lived. Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge were the presidents throughout most of the 1920s. Harding won the election of 1920. This was the first election in which women could vote. And he was also the first president to speak on the radio. In 1920, when he was running for president, he promised a return to normalcy after World War I. The war had been a very chaotic time for Americans and really for everyone involved. And he said, we're going to return to normalcy, get back to what we were like before the war. Now, Harding died while in office, and his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, took office in 1923. He then finished his term and ran for a term of his own and decided not to run for a second full term. Coolidge was known as Silent Cal because he rarely spoke, rarely took action. He believed in very limited government, kind of a hands-off approach. And he believed that people were most free and most prosperous when the government basically got out of the way, where the government didn't interfere in their lives whenever possible. He believed in repealing laws more than making laws. He said basically the fewer laws, the better, the more free people can become. And he also impressively spoke at Howard University, which is a historically black university in Washington, D.C., and he spoke in support of civil rights, which is something that very few white politicians were doing at this time. So good on him for that. The 18th Amendment made alcohol illegal in the U.S. The temperance movement had been growing and growing in America for the past decades. It had mostly been championed by women and Protestants. And the logic behind the prohibition of alcohol was that over half of all violent crime was committed by people while intoxicated. And so the logic said, if we get rid of alcohol, if we make it illegal, then half of all violent crime will cease. So this law called Prohibition was made in an attempt to lower the crime rate and to bolster the nuclear family and lessen people's addiction to this substance. But the results were not so good. This was known as the Noble Experiment because it had very good intentions, but the results were not good at all. Because instead of the crime rate decreasing with the prohibition of alcohol, it actually increased dramatically, especially organized crime increased dramatically in the 1920s because of prohibition. Because now people illegally produced their own alcohol and transported it. It did not get people to stop drinking. Instead, it made people break the law in order to have a drink. Now, this led to the growth of the mafia and organized crime. You have gangsters like Al Capone becoming very rich by bootlegging alcohol and killing all of those who opposed him. The police really could not enforce the law well because crime was so rampant, and the FBI was created at this time in order to try to take down these mob bosses. Prohibition, as I said, it was a noble experiment, but it failed. And therefore, after 14 years, the U.S. government realized that it wasn't working, and so Prohibition ended with the 21st Amendment in 1933. The clash of values, that is a phrase used to describe the differences between the older, more traditional generation of Americans in the 1920s and the younger, less traditional generation in the 1920s. And this occurred kind of as a reaction against World War I. I mean, we were promised that the 20th century would be a century of progress, everything would get better and better, and then World War I kind of dashed all of those hopes. The younger generation, especially young girls, wanted to be very different from their parents because they said, we don't want to be the generation that starts a world war like they did. And you know how that worked out. Flappers were young women who abandoned traditional gender roles. They typically cut their hair very short, which was seen as scandalous. They wore short skirts, they danced, they smoked, they drank in public, all of which was seen as unacceptable behavior for women at that time. Now, this caused a lot of division within the U.S. as the values of the youth really clashed with the values of the older generation. One group of authors that really epitomized this younger generation was the authors of what's called the Lost Generation. Now, it's called the Lost Generation because after World War I, people were quite aimless. They were very disillusioned, disenchanted by life because of what they had seen during the war. And you have American writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway and Sinclair Lewis. They were highly critical of the materialistic, consumeristic, morally depraved society that they perceived taking shape in the U.S., and so they wrote about it. Hemingway wrote classics such as The Sun Also Rises, For Whom the Bell Tolls, A Farewell to Arms, The Old Man and the Sea. And F. Scott Fitzgerald, of course, wrote the great American novel, The Great Gatsby. Now, one event that really epitomized the clash of values in America and how much things were changing, for better or worse, was the Scopes trial. So a little context here, in the 1920s, Tennessee had a law called the Butler Act, and this said that it was illegal to teach human evolution in any public school. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution had been around for about 60 years at this point, and it was widely rejected, especially in Christian areas like the Bible Belt. And in 1925, a teacher named John Scopes broke this law. He taught that human evolution was a fact. He was a science teacher. He taught that in a public school in Dayton, Tennessee, and he was brought to trial for that. And this trial attracted a lot of national media attention in the summer of 1925 because the two most famous lawyers in America went down to Tennessee to argue this case in court. So first off, you have William Jennings Bryan. He was a devout Christian, a creationist. Remember, he had run for president against William McKinley and lost, so people knew who this guy was. Very smart guy, accomplished speaker. And then on the other side, you had Clarence Darrow. He was a part of the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. He was an atheist and a staunch evolutionist. So Clarence Darrow argued that Scopes should be declared innocent for teaching evolution because in his mind, he said it should not be illegal to teach, quote, scientific fact over, quote, religious myths. Well, William Jennings Bryan argued the opposite case. He argued against Scopes that he should be declared guilty because he taught children, quote, the lie of evolution instead of, quote, the truth of God's word. So you have very different worldviews here combating each other. And all of this was broadcast on the radio. Like I said, national media attention. Summer of 1925, people were gathering around the radio, reading in the newspapers. What did Bryan say today? What did Darrow say today? Is Scopes going to go to jail for teaching evolution? Is he going to be fined? Will evolution be allowed in schools? Will it continue to be banned in schools? What's going to happen? Well, the verdict was decided on July 21st, 1925. Scopes was declared guilty because he did break the law. However, he was only fined $100. And this was seen as a defeat for creationist Christians, particularly because it was such a low punishment. It was such a light fine that it was seen as mostly symbolic. Also, creationists felt defeated because Darrow had made Bryan look foolish by attacking his faith very ruthlessly and unkindly on the witness stand. Darrow actually called the prosecuting attorney as a witness, which is something that had almost never happened before. It was highly unorthodox. But he did, and he said, "You're an expert on the Bible, so tell me this." And he just kind of asked him all of these difficult questions, and Bryan eventually got very flustered and started yelling and did not represent his side as well as he could have. And this affected Bryan so harshly that 5 days after the trial, Bryan died of a heart attack. Now, here's someone who was seen as a national treasure, and now he's dead. Not only was this the first court trial broadcasted nationally on the radio, but most Americans had very deeply held beliefs on one side or the other. This was famously called the Scopes monkey trial, monkeys because of evolution. And this really symbolized the clash of values in the 1920s between traditional Judeo-Christian values and more modern secular values. It was also a turning point culturally regarding what is and is not taught in schools. It used to be that you had to teach creation and couldn't teach evolution. And now it's that you have to teach evolution and can't teach creation. And the creation versus evolution debate still continues to this day. The Harlem Renaissance was a huge part of American life in the 1920s. By 1930, about 20% of African Americans lived in the North, as the migration from the South continued in large numbers. Now, in the North, African Americans still faced discrimination in housing and in jobs, but for most, there was at least some improvement in their earnings, some improvement in their standard of living from the nightmare that was sharecropping in the South. The largest black community developed in the Harlem section of New York City. With a population of about 200,000 by 1930, Harlem became very famous in the 1920s as kind of a hotbed for artistic creativity. It had a very high concentration of talented actors, artists, musicians, writers, poets, all in this one section of New York. This boom of artistic achievement in the black community became known as the Harlem Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth, just like there was a Renaissance in Europe in the 1400s or so, where you have all these new forms of art being created. Well, this is like the Renaissance, but for African Americans. There were leading poets in Harlem, including Countee Cullen, Langston Hughes, James Weldon Johnson, and Claude McKay. And oftentimes their poetry, in addition to being very, very beautiful, it was also very perceptive. It commented on the African American heritage. Their poems often expressed a range of emotions from bitterness and resentment about the past to joy and hope for progress in the future. In 1916, a Jamaican immigrant named Marcus Garvey came to Harlem and brought with him a new approach to race issues. He advocated for several things. Black pride, basically not being ashamed of your skin color, which is great. But he also advocated for black nationalism, which is the idea of seeing your race as integral to who you are. Black separatism, basically advocating for willful segregation. And he also advocated for a Back to Africa movement, the idea that African Americans should move to Africa willingly in order to escape America, which has not been very kind to them. Garvey's radical message gained support at first, but then he was tried, convicted, and jailed for fraud. And then people started to doubt and turn against his radical message. One person who supported him at first and then turned on him was W.E.B. Du Bois. He and other black leaders thought that Garvey had gone too far, but still said that he had a point about black pride, that they shouldn't be ashamed of their skin color. Now, the most extreme expression of racism and other prejudices in the 1920s was the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the Ku Klux Klan had started during Reconstruction. It had been disbanded by Ulysses S. Grant and congressional Republicans. But then in 1915, it was resurrected. And unlike the original Klan of Reconstruction, the new Klan, founded in 1915, was just as strong in the Midwest as it was in the South. Northern branches of the KKK, like in Indiana, for example, they directed their hostility not only against black people, because there were relatively few black people there, but they also directed their hostility and hatred against Catholics, Jews, foreigners, immigrants, etc. Now, the new Klan used modern advertising techniques to grow and gain more supporters, to the point where in 1925, there were 5 million American members of the KKK. That is a drastic increase to what it had been. And it drew most of its support from lower to middle class white Protestants in small towns, both in the South and in the Midwest. Now, the Klan employed various methods for terrorizing and intimidating anyone they labeled as un-American. That was one phrase they used a lot. They basically said, America is in danger, our democracy is at stake, anyone who's un-American, we need to attack them, they are a threat, they're going to replace us. And so they dressed in white hoods to disguise their identity, like true cowards. Klan members would burn crosses and apply what they called vigilante justice, which is basically meting out punishments on people they thought were guilty without a trial. They would punish their victims with whips, tar and feathers, and most tragically, even with the hangman's noose, as lynchings had a resurgence in the 1920s. At its peak in the 1920s, the Klan developed strong political influence. In Indiana and Texas in particular, its support became crucial for candidates hoping to win election to state and local offices. You basically could not win election unless you showed support for or membership in the Ku Klux Klan. Now, at first, many native-born white Americans appeared to tolerate the KKK because it at least said it was going to uphold high standards of Christian morality. Who doesn't like that? It said it was going to drive out bootleggers and gamblers and adulterers and get rid of immorality in America. And at first that sounded pretty great to a lot of native-born white Protestants. But all of this changed in the mid-1920s when the true colors of the KKK were revealed. Investigative reports in the Northern press revealed fraud and corruption in the KKK. Then in 1925, the leader of Indiana's Klan, David Stevenson, was convicted of murder. And as you see in the chart there, you see what happened to membership in the KKK within just a year. So you see it progressively growing and growing in the 1920s to where it reached 4 or 5 million people in 1925, but then it had a very precipitous downfall by 1926, where millions left the Klan because they realized it was a terrorist group and a hate group and had a change of heart about it. And after that, the Klan's influence and membership declined very rapidly. Nevertheless, it continued to exist and remained a force for white supremacy really into the 1960s. The KKK still exists today in some form in partnership with neo-Nazi groups, but they have very few followers, and thankfully their influence is very minimal. So let's wrap up the 1920s here. In America, the 1920s was a time of contradictions. You had post-war prosperity, you had technological progress and lots of material wealth, but then on the other hand, you have cultural divisions, increased racial tensions, and global insecurity. In Europe and Asia, you have the rise of totalitarian dictators. For example, in Japan, you have the military taking over the government. In Italy, you have Benito Mussolini and the fascist party taking over. And then in Germany, you have the creation of the Nazi Party under Adolf Hitler. Then in Russia and the Soviet Union, you have Joseph Stalin coming to power. And he took control of the Russian economy, press, schools, military, farms, and food supply. He took control of everything in order to make what he thought would be a communist utopia. He sought to transform Russia into this communist utopia, no matter how many millions of people he had to kill in that process. And boy, did he kill millions. Benito Mussolini came to power in Italy. He instituted a fascist regime with a vision to revive the former Roman Empire in Italy. So he was a very imperialistic and militaristic person. Germany was languishing in hyperinflation and poverty. They were in such a bad economic state after World War I, not just because of all of the destruction that took place there, but also because the Treaty of Versailles treated them so harshly and made them pay billions in reparations, which they couldn't afford. So they started to print money, print more and more and more money to where their currency became basically worthless. And prices went up, 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 and they collapsed into an economic depression. The former Ottoman Empire, which collapsed at the end of World War I in 1918, they became the Republic of Turkey after fighting a war with the Greeks, and they elected Mustafa Kemal as the first president of the Republic of Turkey. They nicknamed him Ataturk, which means father of the Turks, and he really transformed Turkey into the first republic in the Middle East. He gave women the right to vote. He brought forth all of these reforms and made Turkey much more like Western powers. Japan was working towards imperialistic goals. You have civil war breaking out in China between nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek and communists led by Mao Zedong. That would come to dominate a lot of global affairs going forward into the 20th century. And really, the world seemed to be hanging on a precipice. You have this, quote, peace that was really kind of a fake peace, an ersatz peace that was not going to last very long. And the prosperity of the West was also ersatz. It was also kind of fake. It was gilded, to use the term by Mark Twain. Yeah, we have, quote, peace and prosperity, but how real is it? How much longer will it last? Is it really sustainable? And it was all about to come crashing down.